So when I was getting ready this afternoon, in my typical scattered, distracted state, I couldn't find my skinny Bible, which means I've got my 10-pound Bible tonight, which is actually an excuse for a little promo. I remember I was probably 14 when my parents got me the NIV study Bible, and it was just an amazing resource, and they updated it a couple of years ago, and it has really pretty color pictures now, which I also really like. In all sincerity, if you are looking for help in studying and making sense of the scripture and understanding some of the historical background, this is just my personal favorite. Zondervan puts out the NIV study Bible. It's really, really wonderful. So, hey, we are wrapping up our series on Esther tonight before we next week transition with Dr. Gary Oliver into the book of Daniel, and I'm really looking forward to spending a couple of months in the book of Daniel together. As we come to the end of this story of Esther, and we reflect on what is this all about, the celebration, the feast that we just heard about is the Feast of Purim that's celebrated in Israel to this day. And in the description, the very naming of the feast, I think the point of the entire book of Esther comes across. Did you get what that word pure means? The lot. It's the dice that you roll. Now think of the irony of this feast. The entire destiny of wiping out all of the Jewish people was determined by somebody throwing a dice. That was how random, heartless, and reckless the execution of the Jews was. And I think the point of the entire book of Esther could be summed up in the idea that people can throw the dice, but the result is in the hands of the Lord. That He is over every little detail down to the very casting of lots to determine the future of God's people. And so the story is showing us how even in the seemingly insignificant details, God is working to protect His people. And as we come to the end of the story, we really look at the resolution and how all of it plays out. We're going to highlight just a few things that I think are some important takeaways for us to have at the end of this story. So just to catch you up and remind you of what's happened so far, we follow the story of Mordecai and Esther, two cousins that are living in Persia, while the rest of the Jewish people, or many of the Jewish people, are back in Jerusalem rebuilding their destroyed city. And Esther, through a series of circumstances, rises to the place of queen of Persia, and Haman has a plot to have all the Jewish people killed. And he gets King Xerxes, by manipulating him, to sign a decree on a certain day that people can just go out and kill all the Jews. And so Esther, in her courageous moment, there's this really dramatic story that sets the whole thing up, comes in and appeals to the king not to do this. And there's a key moment that we can sometimes miss in how these decrees are played out, because it can seem like this total vindictive thing that the Jews just go out and kill all their enemies. But what we have to notice happens here is, in the episode we looked at last week, when Haman is punished for planning to kill the queen, Xerxes does not revoke the command to kill all the Jews. Why not? Well, that's something that was established early in the story. Persian kings never revoke their order. They never say they're wrong about anything. So if he publishes a decree that goes throughout the whole empire saying do something, he is never going to take that back. It's a little bit, the interviewing advice that when somebody asks for what your biggest weakness is, what do? You do not tell them your greatest weakness, right? You tell them a strength. I just work too hard. I don't know. I guess maybe I'm too smart. I don't know. You don't tell them an actual weakness whenever they ask for your weakness. Persian kings do not take back their commands. So they are trying to figure out how do they protect the Jewish people, and Xerxes saves face and doesn't take back his imperial command. So Esther proposes this. If you won't take back the command to kill the Jews, will you at least give us permission to defend ourselves? See, the initial command was state-sanctioned execution of the Jews. So for any Jew to defend themselves would be mutiny against the state. And so that's the command that Xerxes gives, because that's a good solution. So he just says, I've commanded that they can kill the Jews, now I command the Jews can defend themselves. And that's the setup at the end of chapter 8, is that Xerxes has commanded that the Jews have permission to defend themselves. And then chapters 9 and 10 follow the conclusion to this story and how everything plays out in the end. And as we look at this conclusion, there's three things I want us to just take note of. One is a holy partnership, and then there's a holy war, and finally a holy feast. Let's take a look at those together. First, look at the holy partnership that takes place. In Esther chapter 9, beginning in verse 29, it says, "So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter conferring Purim." One of the interesting debates that people have is who is the main character of this book. Is it Mordecai or is it Esther? It goes back and forth between the two. And I think that's one of the very interesting points that we see developing through here is how God works through both of these people in significant ways. And I think it's very deliberate in this last chapter when the author is highlighting who God is working through. He shows that the authority to write the command comes through both Mordecai and Esther. Karen Jobes, who is a scholar that we've referred to a lot, her commentaries helped us a ton, she makes this observation that the book of Esther shows us women having influence beyond ordination and motherhood. And this is her observation of how it tends to play out in churches, around the debates around women in leadership. And the way it has tended to happen is, in a lot of churches, if they do not ordain women as lead pastors, what they end up saying is, that's okay, you get to have influence as a mom. And by the way, I'm not demeaning the role of mother at all. I think it's one of the most significant, important roles in society and in the church. But one of the things Job says is, we're not left with those as the only two spheres of influence women can have. And one of the things that Esther shows us is the way that God works through a woman in her sphere of influence in this way. And so they're both lifted up, both Mordecai and Esther, as people through whom God is working. Through this partnership, he plays out through both. And that leads into the concept of holy war. And I'll be honest, when I have thought about the book of Esther, this is the topic that has caused me to struggle, wrestle, and squirm the most, is coming to what happens here in Esther chapter 9. In Esther chapter 9, once the decree goes out and we actually get to the description of the war that takes place, we read in chapter 9, verse 5, "The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed," okay, get ready for this. Has anybody ever found themselves in a small group Bible study where they were assigned to read the passage that had all the hard names? Okay, give yourself some grace, okay? If you don't speak Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic, that's okay. So just, a lot of times I skip, I'm going to take a stab at it, but it could come out really interestingly. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. And then look at this last phrase, "But they did not lay their hands on the plunder." Now, when I first read this concept that they gave the Jews permission to do what they pleased to their enemies, I feel deeply troubled inside by that concept. And I actually would encourage you that you probably should too. Because there is a notion that Jesus instructs his people in to love your enemies, to turn the other cheek. And so I come to these moments in the Old Testament where I read the Jews are sent out to do what they please to their enemies, and they kill hundreds. And then we actually read further on that Esther goes back to Xerxes, and he says, "How did it go?" And she tells him how many people are dead, and she goes, "Hey, actually, can we do it again tomorrow? We have a few more enemies we'd like to kill." And I'm sitting here going, is this God's desire? Is this how God wants this to play out? But I think there's something in this phrase, "they did not lay their hands on the plunder," that is actually a clue as to what is theologically going on here. That phrase has great significance in the Old Testament. One of the places we can look to see it is 1 Samuel chapter 15. And 1 Samuel chapter 15 is actually a passage that we might not be as familiar with, but all of the original readers of Esther, if they had grown up around the Hebrew Scriptures, their minds would have gone there instantly with this story. Let me show you why. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, a man named Saul has been made king over Israel. He's the first king of the people of Israel. And we read Samuel as a prophet, and he's speaking to Saul. And Saul has just been sent to war with a group of people called the Amalekites. We're going to go on a little bit of a nerd history tangent here, but just hang with me. It's going to be worth it, okay? When Moses first led the people of Israel out of Egypt, they were traveling on their way up to the Promised Land, minding their own business, and a people called the Amalekites, unprovoked, attacked Israel and tried to wipe them out. And in that moment, God protected them, and he declared judgment on the Amalekites. He said, right now, I'm taking my people to the Promised Land, but there is a day that I will come back and judge the Amalekites. Then when Saul becomes king, God commands Saul, one of your first tasks is to go execute the judgment on the Amalekites that I prophesied I would do back under Moses. And this is what happens after the war. In this moment, this is before the war, and he's about to give Saul this command. He says, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. They are supposed to destroy absolutely everything in the entire civilization. And the rule is, when Israel does this, they are not allowed to take anything to enrich themselves. They're not allowed to take any of the wealth. They're not allowed to take any of the livestock. This is not a way to go get rich by conquering. This is the judgment of the Lord. Now, what Saul does is he goes to war, and the Lord is with him, and he wins, but he tries to keep some things for himself. I actually think it's one of the funniest scenes in the entire Bible, because Saul decides he's going to keep all the livestock to make himself wealthy. And Samuel comes up to Saul after the battle and says, hey, Saul, did you obey the word of the Lord? And he goes, oh, yeah, I obeyed him all right. I killed them all. And then Samuel goes, what's that sound of sheep I hear? Like, I just love picturing that moment where Saul goes, I obeyed him, killed them all. And then Samuel's like, what? Like, the whole point is, when God is executing judgment on a people, the people he's working through are not allowed to use that for personal gain at all. Because it's not about two people going to war against each other. It's about God executing his judgment. And there is an idea in this theology of judgment in holy war that probably sits very uncomfortably, especially with a lot of us in the West, but is a consistent theme throughout the Scripture. And that is that God has the right to judge. Only God has the right to judge, but he certainly does have that right. God, as the creator of the universe, has the right to determine people's destiny. He has the right to punish sin. Humans do not. We do not have the right to judge people's destiny and their future, but God certainly does. And in the history of the Scriptures, we see God doing this in different ways in different eras. Early in the Scriptures, God does it directly and supernaturally. Think of stories like the flood with Noah, where God condemned a civilization and wiped them all out with a flood. You could also think of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God condemned an entire city. And then you can think about God's judgment over Egypt with the 10 plagues, where he brought down his wrath. Those stories early in the books of Genesis and Exodus show God executing his wrath in supernatural ways. And then as he forms the nation of Israel, a transition takes place. God still has the right to judge nations and civilizations. But he begins to do it through the people of Israel, under the leadership of Israel's king. And so we see this with the people of Joshua when they go into the land of Canaan. We see this with the judges of Israel in that period. And then we finally see it under the kingdoms of Israel. And that's why Saul has that role. We see David have that role when he goes to war with Goliath and other battles. But here's the key point. The people of Israel can only go to holy war when they are directly commanded by God, and that command is given through his covenant leader. Every single time Israel decides on their own initiative, we're going to go out and go to war, we're going to go take out our enemies without God's command, they get just beaten down. They don't have the right to go wage war on their own, but God does execute his judgment through them. Now, early, phase 1, God did it supernaturally. During the kingdom of Israel, he did it through Israel's king on the nations that he declared judgment on. And then we're told in the scripture there's a future day where there will be a final judgment, where God has the right and in his justice to determine what is good and right for each person. Here's the significant point for us thinking about this today that has to come home. God only judges nations through holy war and a military, through his express command given through the leader of his people. Who is the leader of God's people today? Who is the king that sits on David's throne, the throne of the people of Israel? Of all the questions we're asking here, here's your Sunday school answer. You get to knock this one out of the park. His name is Jesus. So do you know what that means? No army on earth can claim to be waging holy war in the name of God unless Jesus is physically on the ground acting as their general. So here's the deal. If when Jesus returns to set up his kingdom, he tells all of his people, get armed for battle, we're going to war, we'll obey, right? He has the right to do that. Until then, no nation can claim we are the army of God, executing God's righteousness on earth. That was for a special time when God was working through the nation of Israel, through the Davidic king. Now, what I'm not saying is that nations aren't allowed to go to war with each other for just causes. In the history of Christian interpretation, people have disagreed on what makes a just war, what makes an unjust war. I'm not commenting on that at all. That's a really difficult issue. What I'm saying is, when the nations of the world go to war today, none of them can say, we are God's army, executing God's judgment on you. That right is reserved for the Lord himself. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out for us today. And so it leads us with a very uncomfortable, for me, question of how do we reconcile all of the really horrible things that are going on in the book of Esther? How do we reconcile this young Jewish girl getting taken up into Xerxes' harem? How do we reconcile thousands of people being killed? And it leads to this very deep problem that the book of Esther has been raising over and over again, which is how do we understand the place of evil in God's plan? And I think it raises the interesting question that theologians have wrestled with for a long time. What options are there for what God could do with evil? Option one is he could prevent it from ever happening. I mean, he could do that, right? God could make it such that people could never choose to do anything evil, and he could prevent anything evil from ever happening. And I don't know why he hasn't done that. And you know what answer the Bible gives? It doesn't answer the question. Job, when he demanded an answer for God on why have you let this happen in my life, he actually says, I want God to go to court. I have an objection, and I would like God to answer for what he's done in my life. And you know what God's answer is? Does God explain everything wrong that happened in Job's life? God, I actually think it's one of like the sassiest speeches God ever gives. Because God looks at him and says, Job, you are so wise. You were there, right, when I laid the foundations of the earth? That was you that put the boundaries of the oceans, didn't you? You designed the cosmos and created the stars, didn't you, Job? What's God's point? God doesn't answer Job's question. He says, Job, the answer to this question is beyond you. He tells Job, Job, you need to trust my wisdom. You need to trust that I know what I'm doing. So God could have prevented any evil from ever happening, and for some reason in his wisdom, he didn't. The second option is he could have allowed evil to alter his plans and purposes. He could have allowed evil to come in and wreck everything that he had planned for earth. Or the third option is he could allow evil to exist, but only as a part of his larger purpose. That he could allow evil into the world, but never allow that evil to alter the good things he wanted to do. I'm about to go into deep nerddom here. But in Tolkien's Silmarillion, which gives the backstory to the Lord of the Rings, there's this fantastic creation story account that I just love. And in the story, the way God creates the universe is through a song that he composes. And every piece of the song, every melody, every line is a different element of creation. And the Satan figure in the myth keeps on coming in and trying to sing nasty notes that mess up the composition. And he constantly fails because every wrong note he throws in, God moves the chords so that his wrong notes actually make the whole composition more beautiful. All of Satan's attempts to wreck this story, God is so creative, so wise, and so good that he keeps on bending it back into something even more beautiful. And I think Tolkien is really on to the picture here. That somehow, in God's infinite wisdom that we don't understand, he has allowed horrible, atrocious things to happen in the world. He's not the author of evil. He never does anything evil. He is wholly and completely good. And he is so wise and so good and so powerful that he has so made it that even the most horrendous things somehow, at the end of the story, will only lead to the greater glory and goodness that he has planned for his people. Now, a little emotional awareness tip. That is something that is really helpful to reflect on before you're in the midst of tragedy, and oftentimes after tragedy. Walking into someone in the middle of tragedy and telling them, hey, I know this hurts right now, but God's going to use it for good things, not the most sensitive thing to do. I think it's really helpful to have a theology of how pain and suffering works into the larger plan of God before you're in the midst of the deep hurt. Because in that moment of hurt, knowing that it's going to all work out for good may not be that particularly helpful for the pain you're in. In that moment, that pain can overwhelm everything else. And probably the most comforting thing is just to know God is with you. He's with you and he loves you. And people are with you and love you in that too. And so I think one of the things that the book of Esther leads us to see is how God is able to protect and care for his people even in the midst of some really horrible things that are coming to them. And he guides through this holy war to defend his people, to protect his people. And like everything else in Esther, it's ambiguous. It looks to me like on the one hand they launched out in holy war, but in my own current reading, I think probably day 2 was Esther just being spiteful. It seems to me like she just kept going. I don't know for sure because the narrator doesn't explain to us. We don't have the voice of God in this story explaining which actions are to be taken which ways. But I do think that phrase, they didn't touch the plunder, shows us that what's happening here is a mirror of that holy war. And here's the other connection that brings all that together. Do you remember how the name of the people were the Amalekites? The king of the Amalekites that Saul was supposed to kill was a man named Agag. Do Do you remember who it said that Haman is a descendant of? Agag the Amalekite. The other thing that a good Israelite reading the story would have recognized was the judgment on Haman is the completion of the judgment that God said he was going to do back under Moses. That God has the right to judge. He has the right to bring his wrath in his timing and in his way. So then, where does that leave us today as the new covenant people of God? What do we do? Like, where does God's wrath and God's judgment fit for us? How do we understand our place in that if we don't have the military commander of God here to lead us in battle? Well, I think the answer to that question is going to come through taking a look at the concept of the holy feast. Coming back to chapter 9, verse 20. We read about the initiation of this feast called Purim. It says that Mordecai recorded all the events, and he sent out the letter in verse 21 to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies. There's a pattern in Jewish faith of when God intercedes in a powerful way that they need to have a feast to remember it. That remembering of the feast, the remembering of the event, helps them to be reminded of God's faithfulness. It allows them to say, if God did this in the past, then I can trust that he will continue to do it in the future. If God delivered us through Purim in this really powerful way, then the God who made the covenant, that made a promise to protect his people, we can count on him to continue to do that. And when I read this story of God going to war on the behalf of his people to save and protect them and establishing a feast that they are to take to remember what God has done, I can't help but thinking about another feast that God initiated. We read about it in Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, we read, "While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take and eat. This is my body.' Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" You see, the story of Esther is the last time in biblical history that we see God going to war on behalf of his people. It's the last example of holy war, when God fought the enemies of his people to protect and defend them. And they all knew that when Messiah came, that was what Messiah was going to do. That was the job of Joshua, the leader of the armies of Israel. That was the job of Saul and David, the kings of God's people. And they knew that when the Messiah came, he was going to fight for them. And when when Jesus showed up as the Messiah, as the Son of David, and he comes into Jerusalem on that donkey, they know here is our deliverer who's going to fight for us. And on Passover, he starts a new feast. And he says, "I am the one who's going to start a new covenant with the people of God. And I am about to destroy your enemies." And I don't think anyone in that room that night knew what form it was going to take. And we are very blessed that it took the form it did. Because the reality that Jesus showed people was that even the people of God's covenant community had put themselves in the place of God's enemy. Because of sin, we were God's enemies. We were the ones who deserved to be wiped out. If God went to war on holy war, guess which side of the battle lines we would be on? We are on the side that should be wiped out. We are on the side of people that need judgment. I can sit here ready for God to rain down hell on all the people I'm mad at. But what Jesus taught is that I am in need. That I am the one standing condemned. And Paul summarized it this way in Romans chapter 8. This is the beauty of the good news of the holy war that Jesus fought. It says, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" We live in an era where holy war has taken on a whole new meaning. Because Christ died for his enemies, he said, "I'm showing you what a new covenant looks like." In the new covenant, God is not here to strike down sinners. God is here to die for sinners. And he says that now our struggle is not against other people on this earth. Our struggle is against Satan, sin, and death, and Christ has conquered them all through the blood of his cross and through his resurrection. And so we now have a feast that we get to take as followers of Jesus to remind ourselves of what Christ has done on our behalf, that he went to war and he died for his enemies so that he could make us his children. And that the enemy that we actually needed defeated, he has taken care of. So as we celebrate tonight, we're going to invite you to come down. We've got tables here up at the front. As we begin to sing, we just want to invite you to come forward and take the elements and take them on your own time as we continue to sing and celebrate, remembering that the good news of Jesus is that we are no longer at war with God. He does still fight for his people. And for that reason, we remember the body that was broken for us, the blood that was spilled for us, and we wait for his kingdom and his coming.